Welcome back to the Done Deal Show. I'm Terry Flewers, as you all know. Hit the like and the share button. I'm joined today by everyone we know as Ben Jacobs, but the senior football correspondent at Give Me Sport. Ben Jacobs is here with us today. How are you, mate?
I'm good. You've outdressed me today. That's a first.
This shirt, I love this shirt. I'm not gonna lie. It's a bit Hawaii. I call it my Tony Soprano shirt. My Tony Soprano shirt. I'm loving it. It's an interesting day today, especially if you're a Man United fan, which we're going to delve into. Lots of transfer stories and updates, viewers, for you guys. Any questions, send them in. Super chats, followed by member chats. We will always prioritize to our viewers as well. I wanted to start off actually with Man United because last night's news was welcome news to some, frustrating news to others, a shock to some. What everybody expected. There's a number of journalists today that are licking some wounds on socials. I do feel a bit sorry for them. But Ten Hag stays at Man United. And what's your understanding around the decision for Ineos and co to keep him in charge?
Yeah, I think my understanding is pretty much the same as I reported before the FA Cup final, that we were going to have this review. And naturally, winning the FA Cup final is a big tick in Ten Hag's favour and one of the factors that was considered. But in addition, you've got that lowest Premier League finish. So the review did two things over the 2 weeks. One, it looked back at the season, and not only from a football sense, but operationally as well. And then the other thing was this projection amongst those doing the review as to what might change and what Ten Hag might be like in this new project, because ultimately were his hands tied by what he inherited. And I think that the challenge of the review and why it took so long is on that second point, because to project and decide whether or not Ten Hag is the right manager going forwards, which we now know that he is in Manchester United's eyes, you also have to look at other eventualities, and that includes succession planning and due diligence. So they had to go and yardstick Ten Hag against other names to see who they thought was the best football personality and strategic fit. And it might feel painstaking. And cynics may say, well, they met with Tuchel, they met with Pochettino, they thought about Frank, they considered McKenna and he signed a new Ipswich deal. And then they came back to Ten Hag, who was in Ibiza in the dark. But the reality is that Ten Hag, according to Manchester United sources, became the clear conclusion. And in a sense, it's true that Ten Hag was almost re-interviewing for his job. And like any interview, you would expect other candidates to be considered, because it isn't due diligence if you don't also see who else is out there in the market. And that's what makes the review thorough. But the good news is we got clarity heading into the window, which obviously only opens in a couple of days' time. Yeah. And on top of that, Ten Hag is in ongoing negotiations for a new contract. Now, remember, after his contract expires, there is an option to extend it by a year. But instead, Manchester United want to reward Ten Hag and discuss a new deal. And in the new deal, we might even see a change towards this head coach, and that will reflect in Ten Hag's role within recruitment and this new model. And I think people asked me at the time, why did Chelsea take super speed and Manchester United not? And the reality, I think, is because Chelsea have a more established model now. Those in charge have been there for 2 years. The recruitment team, the sporting directors anyway, have been there for long enough that everything is more settled. And we know that Chelsea have had their bumps and hurdles, but I mean strategically and executive-wise. Whereas with Manchester United, you've got Ratcliffe and his team that have only been in since February. You've got Omar Barada, who hasn't quite yet started. You've got an interim CEO in Jean-Claude Blanc. You've got Jason Wilcox, who is new. You've got Sir Dave Brailsford, who's done 100 or so day review of every department, not just the football one. You've got Dan Ashworth, who they've not even agreed compensation for. So you've got everything new about Manchester United, but it's not yet stuck and people are not yet in. And they're being asked to review a manager with very limited time spent with that manager. And this is why I think the impact of the last thing they remember from the season of winning the FA Cup, and not just doing so, but with an outstanding performance and a tactical masterclass, in my opinion, by Ten Hag, I think that counted in his favour. So Ten Hag stays, and now that's that for another Manchester United saga, and we move on to the window.
Absolutely. And look, I've been very honest about it. My personal preference was to move on from him. I just felt that again, I'm looking from the outside in based on what we know. And we all as fans know less than everybody that's internal. But in previous years, I've been far more forthright in pushing for what I want as a fan because I didn't trust the people running the club from a football standpoint, the Woodwards and co. I still stand by this. They're bankers, they're marketers, they're accountants. They shouldn't be making football decisions, in my humble opinion. But I felt differently about this. I had my personal subjective feelings towards Ten Hag, but I said all along that I'm going to be objectively supportive because I'm going to trust that the football decision makers at the club, and I think we're all being really naive if the likes of Barada and Dan Ashworth are not having an input in situations. We've all worked in the professional world. We know how it really works. We've even heard about leaked emails, so we know something's going on. I'm putting my faith in the football decision makers to get it right, and I think some Man United fans have got to look beyond the end of their nose. They've got to get out of their own emotions and feelings and understand that the club need to build a foundation in this structure that will see us right in the medium to long term. And they've interviewed a number of other available managers. And there might be some better names out there, but they either didn't want the Man United job, didn't want to be interviewed, or they're not available. And in the end, we've decided that with everything that's going on, this is the best case scenario for us. Now, the proof is going to be in the pudding. I think Man United fans should drop their anger, drop their frustration, and get behind the structure being built and not become fixated on the manager. Because for me, Ben, what we're now doing is fundamentally different from any stage since Fergie. We no longer have a manager, in my opinion. We have a head coach. We will be taking away lots of responsibilities from him, and his job is to coach the first team in the way in which the club wants to play. And I'm glad that we're moving away from this model of essentially allowing the club to be built in the image of the manager, because we're never going to have another Fergie. The Fergie type eras are done now. So look, I'm not personally like jumping from the rooftops because Ten Hag's staying, but I'm happy that the saga's over and we can now move on to transfers. And when it comes to Man United transfers, Ben, what does it look like? Well, first player I wanted to ask you about was Ivan Toney. I saw a report yesterday that he's on a United shortlist. We've also seen him linked to Tottenham as well. What's your understanding about Man United and Spurs' pursuit of him and where he might end up by the end of the summer?
Yeah, I don't think there's a Spurs pursuit at the moment. I think with Manchester United, it's a possibility because we know even from January, they wanted a more experienced striker. And it's that balance, isn't it? Because you need someone that can complement Rasmus Højlund. You need trust in Rasmus Højlund, but you also need goals because ultimately, unless Marcus Rashford adds another 30 like he did the season before last, there's a gap there. And you have to think about the now. And this is where somebody like Toney may come into Manchester United's thinking, but only if I'm told the price drops below 50 million. And there's no guarantees there. He's not on the Arsenal or the Chelsea list. I know we've repeatedly heard Toney linked with Chelsea, but as I've reported, and I can only give you my own knowledge, and I've said this for months, Toney has never really been in Chelsea's thinking, and we'll come on to Jhon Duran for Chelsea fans a little bit later. But I don't think it's only Ivan Toney. There are other options that are less Premier League proven and fall into a slightly younger mold, and Joshua Zirkzee is one example of that. The feeling for weeks really with Zirkzee is that Milan are going to get that one over the line, but they haven't yet. And if something collapses, the door becomes open. And Manchester United and Arsenal have both seriously looked at Zirkzee as well. And then we obviously know they'd put a proposal on the table for Benjamin Sesko, but they were never one of the front runners there. It was very much, as I was told anyway, stay at Leipzig, very concrete and realistic possibility. And I think people were surprised when I said that. We spoke about that last week, and I've reported that pretty consistently before it was officially confirmed this morning. And the reason for that is because the player's got a very savvy agent. They know that in that kind of model, you can always get the move. You're never going to have a roadblock. You're never at that age going to be denied the opportunity to move to the Premier League. So it's about the timing. And he felt that settling his future before the Euros, having hopefully a big Euros, raising in value because of that, and then revisiting the situation in a year's time. And the 1 year extension just means that even without the release clause, a formal one anyway, the valuation is just the valuation, because in a year's time with a year's extension, you're ultimately in exactly the same place, contractually speaking. So Sesko will still likely move in summer 2025, possibly in 2026. But from Manchester United's point of view, that gives away a little bit because they were concrete in a proposal, the type of profile, and that leans more towards a younger striker. So it'll be interesting now to see if they pivot in completely the opposite direction and try their luck for Ivan Toney. At the moment, there's no real advanced discussions with any Premier League club, though, for Toney. And I'm told that Saudi could be one to watch as well at his age and with the kind of money that he's looking for. Let's wait and see if a concrete proposal emerges. When in January there was speculation about Toney, Saudi deal makers did make an informal approach, and Toney made it clear off the back of the ban for gambling, so he'd only just returned to football, that he didn't want to resolve his future at that point, and he didn't want to go to Saudi Arabia. So Toney, a bit like Lukaku, would have to change his mind. But just keep one eye on Saudi, and that's good news for Brentford, because ultimately if they are going to sell this summer, they can leverage that kind of big offer even if the player doesn't want to move. But I'll say one other thing on Toney, which again I've reported before, but I'll just repeat in case you're not avid listeners to every word or every show on here, and that's that there is this other possibility, because Brentford can't afford a new deal for Toney due to the wages. They're not going to, in likelihood, extend him. And therefore, Toney could agree, because he feels very loyal to Brentford, to do one extra season, and then free agency comes into play. And that's when clubs may be prepared to pay the wage demands because the fee is removed from the equation.
Yeah, it's going to be a real interesting one with him. And it does. I know the transfer window isn't open, but it feels like quite a slow start. As you say, not much advance at the minute. We've obviously seen Tosin go to Chelsea. But look, Toney's a player I like, and I'd love a player like him complementing. I like some of the other young players we're linked to, but I do like the idea of somebody a bit older, a little bit more experienced in and around Rasmus Højlund for him to learn off as well. But we'll see in that space. Another player that United are linked to, Ben, and I think it's kind of a nice segue into Chelsea as well, is Michael Olise. And we've seen various reports, some in the sort of Give Me Sport, where that we both work with and are associated with, that verbal personal terms have been agreed. There's the Athletic came out yesterday stating, and it was quite an interesting comment around the club have said, you deal with us first before you go to the player. And after everything that happened last year, I think that was quite an interesting kind of pushback by Crystal Palace. What's your understanding of the latest surrounding Michael Olise and where he could end up this summer?
Yeah, no disrespect to the reporting of others, but my understanding is that the Olise side haven't agreed anything with any club at this point, and Chelsea are more locked, I suppose, in a need to bring in a winger, because remember, Enzo Maresca is obsessed with wingers over wide forwards in this 4-3-3. And I think the recruitment team, we know 12 months ago, had come very close to getting Michael Olise. So it's no surprise that Chelsea are back in the mix there. Whereas with Manchester United, they know they can play on the fact that Olise is this boyhood Manchester United fan, but is that position the number one priority? So Olise may be the priority target name-wise, but Manchester United need to think about what position they want to move for first. And it's interesting with Olise because he will want a speedy decision, but he will also want guarantees that if he goes quickly to a new club, those clubs will let him play in the Olympics, because he's already been named in Thierry Henry's squad. And maybe clubs are prepared for that. But remember, Chelsea, even though they allowed Leslie Okwichukwu to join up with Thierry Henry's squad because they don't see him as part necessarily of their imminent first team plans, which is code for he could be loaned out, the other two that Thierry wanted, Malo Gusto and Benoit Badiashile, were blocked from going to the Olympics, as was Mykhailo Mudryk and Enzo Fernandez. So if Olise joined Chelsea today, and then Chelsea said, it's fine, there's nothing we can do, you've already been named, go off to the Olympics, what does Malo Gusto and Benoit Badiashile think? Perhaps they're understanding because they realise permission was already given, or maybe Olise has to consider withdrawing from that Olympic squad. So that's another little twist in all of this, that right now we're talking about players and how they want to decide before the Euros or after the Euros. But think about the Olympics. And if Olise wants to play in the Olympics, he will either have to seek guarantees that he's the exception to the rule, because Manchester United are blocking players as well from going off to the Olympics. Look at Garnacho, for example. Yeah. So that's just a little side plot. But coming back to the complexity, Michael Olise has a new release clause, which is near double the old one. When Chelsea thought they'd triggered it, Crystal Palace said, you've gone about it the wrong way. Chelsea denied any tapping up. They walked away. Olise signed a new deal. Flash forward 12 months, Olise's got a new release clause. It's in the region of 60 to 65 million. And much like the old one, there is a complicated protocol for how you trigger the release clause or place another offer. And the terms of the clause in any negotiation around Olise say you go to Crystal Palace, you express your interest to Crystal Palace, which I know people think is just how transfers work, but very often you do go to the player side. And as long as you're transparent about it, then that is still industry practice. So it doesn't mean tapping up automatically if you just make an inquiry to an agent or the player's camp. But in this situation, everything filters through Palace. And then if you want to make an offer or trigger the clause, you tell Palace tell Olise. And then if Olise is interested, Palace will then allow you to negotiate with Olise. And then Olise will tell Palace, and Palace will come back to the club, even if they've already agreed a package. So Palace become both selling club, negotiator, as you would expect, and almost intermediary for Olise to put, some would say, a wall between Olise and the suitors, but it protects Crystal Palace because it means that it's all very transparent. So this idea, therefore, that anyone's gone to Olise, got his buy-in, agreed verbal terms, means they either have already gone to Palace, which is not my understanding yet, but it may change very quickly, or alternatively, people are always going to distance themselves from anything they've done in the Olise camp, because all suitors know, based on 12 months ago, that this has to be done by the book. So the next step is who makes the first formal approach to Palace? And then does Olise say, I want to decide now, which is possible? Or does he say, you know what, I think Manchester United will come, Man City, Newcastle as well, so I'm going to wait. And then, of course, the other thing in terms of timing is how long does he want to wait? And you have, I think, a scenario where he decides now, and part of the deal is he can or can't obviously go to the Olympics, and his preference is still to play. Or the other thing is if people don't want him to play and he's happy enough at Crystal Palace, then if he wants to, he can leave it later in the window, go and play at the Olympics, and then we may revisit this situation right at the end of the window. So I don't think there's any extreme. I think we're either going to have Olise resolved really quickly so he knows where he stands, either staying at Palace, which remember is still one possibility. Let's not discount it. It's kind of similar in some ways to the Sesko situation. Everyone's talking about the who wants Olise and forgetting the great season that Crystal Palace had in terms of their ending under Glasner. So that remains one possibility as well. But I think in terms of timing, it's either going to happen pretty quickly or Olise may wait and presume, if not commit to Palace, go and play the Olympics. And then let's see whether right at the end of the window, anyone makes another late attempt, because of course the release clause is always still there. The other thing people ask me, of course, is who's the favourite between Manchester United and Chelsea? And I'll say what I've said before, which is heart-wise, Olise has this Manchester United affiliation. It's his boyhood club and all of that. But in his head, he'd already joined Chelsea at one point 12 months ago, only for these dramatic U-turns and hitches and accusations. And then he settles his future, obviously, with a new deal at Crystal Palace. So Chelsea are confident. They've got the Joe Shields factor as well, who's got a very strong relationship with the player. But it's not just Chelsea versus Manchester United. It's also Crystal Palace. It's potentially Manchester City. And I think if Newcastle were to sell Bruno Guimarães, they'd enter the race. But I don't see them having the funds to move right now. So it's going to be an interesting one to watch. And I think that we might not have to wait too much longer now for a little bit more clarity.
Absolutely. It's and again, you read different reports every single day. Really great and fantastic in-depth breakdown there, Ben. Staying with Chelsea, there's talk today. I mean, Fabrizio Romano has spoken about this and pushed out this news as well, that negotiations between Chelsea and Aston Villa for Durán are ongoing. There's some reports from the continent that a 50 million offer is close to being put in. What's your understanding around this deal? We know Chelsea have shown interest before. Is it as close as some outlets are suggesting, or are we being slightly misled there in your eyes?
Well, I think there's history here, remember, because Chelsea were really on Duran's case in January, and then he picked up an injury and it kind of went cold. So the first discussions of Duran have already taken place, and they came when Villa had started exploratory talks for Conor Gallagher. But remember, Villa need to sell, and then they can look at buying. And this is why there's appeal to them in the Douglas Luiz deal, where they might get some cash from Juventus and a couple of players, because then you get 2 signings and you get a bit of money. And then if they can sell Duran, they might be in a position to make 1 big signing. They've got Champions League money, but Champions League money comes with Champions League bonuses for players. So in some respects, it's great to have, financially speaking, but if you don't sustain it, then you can put yourself in a position in the long term, as Newcastle find, where if you get it and then lose it, then you need to protect yourself financially as a club, which is why some of the big clubs like Manchester United and now Chelsea have got Champions League decreases. If you don't qualify for it, your wage bill goes down, and that helps. But Villa need to sell ultimately. Duran is the kind of young profile that Chelsea really like. And for whatever reason, Unai Emery in particular, and quite vocally, I'm told, does not see Duran as part of his plans. So this isn't just about Chelsea wanting Duran. This is also about Villa wanting to sell. And because of that, Chelsea will feel that they can get a better deal. So I'm not aware yet, and things change very fast, of course, but I'm not aware yet of reports surrounding a deal being already done or verbally agreed to the tune of £40 million. We're not there yet. And in January, Chelsea were looking more at 25 or 30 million pounds for Duran. So it'd be good business for Aston Villa if they've hiked up the price by another 10 million. But Duran is a concrete target, and as I reported last week, a more realistic one than Sesko even. So Chelsea was serious about Sesko, but they also sensed that he may well stay at Leipzig, and if he was to move, Arsenal might be ahead of them. So even last week, Duran was maybe ahead of Sesko in the list of possibilities for Chelsea. And that remains the case. He's exactly the kind of profile they're looking for. And because Nicholas Jackson scored 17 goals in the end in all competitions, and Christopher Nkunku can play as a false 9, it means Chelsea feel that they don't necessarily need that really proven, experienced, guaranteed double figures striker, because they trust Jackson based on the second half of the season, and they trust that Nkunku can add goals, and they know that Cole Palmer will also likely again get into double figures, especially because he's the penalty taker too. So then goals aren't as much of a problem for Chelsea. I think it was 77 in the Premier League and 100 plus in all competitions. So therefore, now when they're looking for a striker, compared to, let's say, under Graham Potter, it's not about, yikes, we need that one person to single-handedly cover the burden of our output because we're scoring a really small amount of goals. It's very much, let's replicate the goals tally from last season, and let's make sure that we concede 20 less, and then you've suddenly got Champions League football or better. And this is why Chelsea are looking at a younger profile. So talks are continuing to progress with Duran, and let's see whether or not Chelsea decide to place a formal and written offer, because at the moment everything is still verbal.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, some Chelsea fans are concerned about it in terms of thinking they need a more experienced striker up front. So I understand that challenge. Simon Jones in the Mail has said today that Dominic Solanke is also understood to be on Chelsea's list of targets. Could that be one? Is Duran a bigger priority over him, or are they sort of working on these deals simultaneously, working out which one is best for them?
Yeah, you spin multiple plates. I told a story the other day that I'll repeat, which is Cole Palmer was 4th on Chelsea's list. And when the Olise deal failed, they had 3 other options. They ended up getting Palmer, but you're concurrently working on all these deals. So it's not a 1, don't get the player, then 2, don't get the player, etc. It's more depth. And if you've got deep targets, then you're happy with all of them. So you line all of them up. And then based upon the negotiations advancing, you work out things like, does the player want us or another club? Is there value to be had? Has our bid been accepted or rejected? And so on. So you can't just rank players only based upon who you want. You also have to rank them based upon who you can get, who's value for money. And ultimately, all of that means that it's not just a list in order, it's a little bit more of a grey area. And your strength in a recruitment is in your strength in depth. And this is why Chelsea will engage with Duran, But at the same time, Durán knew there was a proposal on the table for Sesko. And at the same time, there's 4 or 5 other targets as well, all of which you have to get to the point of the club and the player thinking like it's viable without over-promising, of course, and then you will decide at that point. And I think this is why we always hear clubs linked with so many. With Dominic Solanke, there is no urgency for the player to leave Bournemouth. He's not going to be forcing a move away. And we know he knows Chelsea, of course, very well because he was there earlier in his career. There's a £65 million release clause. That's not something I'm told that Chelsea feel is worth triggering or even using as a yardstick for valuation. But it is true that in internal discussions and informative movement, if you like, Solanke has come into the conversation at Chelsea in the same way that Julian Alvarez has. With both players, there's been no movement yet. There's been no start of a club-to-club negotiation. So this is very much just sounding out players, internal discussions, agent talk, if you like. But there's certainly some substance, I'm told, to the Solanke links. But again, it looks like Chelsea are more advanced with Duran at this point.
Yeah, it certainly does. You mentioned Julian Alvarez there. I mean, I just think he's such a phenomenal football player. How likely is it that he ends up at another Premier League team this summer, in your opinion? Chelsea seemingly the only club we've seen linked to him, but can you see that deal happening this summer?
Yeah, Chelsea haven't made a move yet, and Man City will fight to keep Alvarez. So we're not looking at a 50, 60 million pound deal. We're probably looking at in excess of 70 million. And that's a big outlay to get a player that, due to a mixture of his talent and his value and injuries as well, started the vast majority of Premier League games. I was surprised because I've always, if we go away from the transfer market with my fantasy team, I've always been reticent with Alvarez because historically I've not known whether he's just going to come on or whether he's going to start regularly. But I looked and I think he started 31 of 38 Premier League games last season, which tells you that he was very important, integral even. So what Alvarez is looking for is for Man City to say, that's going to happen again. And you're going to get regular starts, not just games and appearances, but starts. And if they can give him those guarantees, then he won't go anywhere. But it may be that they can't heading into this season if everybody is fit. And that's where Alvarez may start to think maybe there's another opportunity. There's been no approach yet to Manchester City from Chelsea. We know also that usually the position of Pep Guardiola, we saw it with Raheem Sterling and Cole Palmer, when the player says, I want to go, the club are very understanding. But this is a bit different, and there'll be much more of a fight and much more friction to keep Alvarez at Manchester City. So it's going to take a really big bid, the kind of number that the Premier League clubs that have been vaguely linked don't necessarily have just to drop, because that's the number they're looking to bring in 2 or 3 for, not just 1. So I'm told there's more substance at this stage with PSG. They're the club that really like Alvarez, and because of Mbappe's departure, have got the kind of funds that might make it possible. So keep an eye on PSG. I think a move away from the Premier League is more likely than a move within the Premier League at this stage, just because of the number that Manchester City would expect. I'm also told that Atletico Madrid really like Julian Alvarez, but have got absolutely no chance of doing the deal at that number. But they're on the lookout for another lead striker as well. Alvaro Morata had a wonderful season. There's some interest in him from Saudi Arabia and also from Serie A as well. And he would be open, I'm told, to returning back to Italy. So Atleti are kind of planning because they feel like perhaps they'll need another striker, but they're not going to be able to do a deal either at 70 plus million. So price is an obstacle, as is the fact that Manchester City want to keep Alvarez. And because they want to keep Alvarez, the price is only going to get higher because they're going to use their valuation, if anyone comes calling, as a way of trying to ward off suitors rather than give a more reasonable number to engage in negotiations. So I think Alvarez is going to be tough, but let's wait and see what Chelsea do. At the moment, like I say, they've not made any kind of approach yet to Manchester City. So although we can't rule it out because he's one of those names that's come up and has been discussed internally, PSG are the more realistic suitor at this point.
There we go. Viewers, give us your thoughts, give us your feelings in relation to that. And yes, it's certainly an interesting one. And the one thing I think that City fans have got to understand about this is City, I wouldn't call it maybe an official policy. It's probably not written down anywhere. But when a player decides they don't want to be there, they're pretty good at facilitating them to leave, because they're a well-run club, and they understand that as soon as somebody's head's turned, you sort of had this with Ferran Torres, you had it with Leroy Sané. You often don't get the same player out of them. So it's going to be an interesting one to watch. In terms of exits from Chelsea, Conor Gallagher, probably for the last 6 to 9 months, him leaving has been on the cards. What's your latest understanding of his potential exit and the clubs in the sort of the front runners for him?
Yeah, Gallagher's in no rush. He's obviously at the Euros now, so we have to respect the player in this who's been a model professional, and this isn't the first window where we hear Gallagher speculation. So it's one I would imagine we can put on the back burner a little bit, because I don't see Gallagher wanting to suddenly jettison off to a video call or something, or hold a meeting in Germany about his future in the middle of the Euros. And therefore, because Chelsea are confident that they've satisfied the PSR situation, it means that this 30th of June deadline is not as important. The money they're looking for is with a view to the following financial year. And that means that they don't have to find this so-called pure profit on Gallagher between now and the accounting deadline on the 30th of June. So all of that leads towards it being a slightly slower saga. And Gallagher would love to stay at Chelsea, by the way. It's just a case of whether his role becomes more diminished under Enzo Maresca. In a 4-3-3, the logical conclusion will be that Caicedo is a midfield destroyer and that Enzo Fernandez is a kind of Tony Cruz type player, a defensive-minded midfielder, but essentially a playmaker who everything flows through. And then you've only got one more midfield spot. And there's Andre Santos, Casadei, who played under Enzo Maresca at Leicester. You've got Carney Chukwuemeka, who might be forced to almost play in that role in midfield, because I don't think they'll want to use him in a wide capacity. And then in addition, you've got Romeo Lavia and Leslie Okwuchukwu. So at some point, something's got to give. The interesting thing about the 4-3-3 at Chelsea is that you've got Jackson in the middle, or potentially Nkunku as a false 9. But if Jackson's in the middle, then how do you get in Cole Palmer and Christopher Nkunku, unless one of them is in attacking midfield behind the striker and the other one is on the wide right? Because I would imagine that Mykhailo Mudryk, Raheem Sterling will be the wide left-sided player at the moment. And if Olise comes, then even more so. If you put Olise on one side, Mudryk on the other side, then you've got to pick between Jackson or Nkunku, and Palmer likely is going to be playing behind. So then where does Conor Gallagher play? And this is why Chelsea feel in the long run, as much as they value Conor Gallagher, it may make financial sense to sell him this window. But the player will have a say too. So the Villa talks, I'm told, were only very exploratory. And Villa are not in a position where they can sign Conor Gallagher financially, because Chelsea want 50+ million. So if Durán gets done, one deal, it won't be a swap deal, I'm told, but effectively it could be, because you might do Durán and then you may wait because Gallagher doesn't want it done at the same time. And then because of Durán, you may get the funds to come back in. But I don't think they'll be linked as of now. I think if Durán moves, it will be quick and it will be a separate deal, but then Villa may have the funds to be able to move for Gallagher at a later point. But at this stage, they've not placed an offer and they can't meet Chelsea's valuation. Tottenham, on the other hand, are expected to bid at some point, and they valued 12 months ago Gallagher at 35 million. I don't think they'll go as high as 50, but they might go up to somewhere around the 40 million mark at a top end. So let's wait and see if that develops. But they're the club to watch for Gallagher at the moment. But he doesn't have a concrete offer at this stage. So his focus is on the Euros. He'd love to stay at Chelsea. He'd love to get a new deal if he could. But there's nothing advanced on that front either. And when people sort of say, well, it's not advanced because Gallagher's being greedy, that's not my understanding either. He's looking to become one of the top 10 earners at Chelsea, because he has been a near automatic starter, the second best player behind only Cole Palmer, and for many games in the absence of Reece James, captain of the football club. So shock horror, a player playing regularly as one of 10 outfield players wants to be one of the best 10 paid players at the club. And that's not greedy, that's just common sense given his stature at the football club. And I can tell you pretty categorically that whatever Gallagher may want at Chelsea will be the same number that he's looking for elsewhere at a club like Villa, who have got a lower wage bill, or a club like Tottenham. This is not Gallagher asking for 200k, 250k. This is Gallagher simply saying he wants his wage to reflect his stature at the football club.
Which I think makes absolute perfect sense. It really, really does. Viewers, any questions you've got, feel free to send them in to us. Super chats, member chats, we will prioritize, as you will know. Two clubs where there doesn't seem to be much conversation going on at the moment. First one being Liverpool. What's your understanding going on there? Are there any sort of names that you're hearing in connection to Liverpool at this present moment?
Yeah, Liverpool are always quite quiet. It's how they work. We know that. And I think there's two key areas where we know they're going to strengthen as well. One is in the wide type area, with a view to what Liverpool do very wisely, I think, which is find a player before they lose a player. And that means that you're almost constantly wondering what Liverpool need, because they've got. And then if they can replace before they lose, that's just smart recruitment. And I think this is why they are always calm despite the noise. And the other thing I would say about Liverpool, just before we get into names, is if your recruitment is wise, then after a bit of business and a flurry, such as their midfield revamp 12 months ago, if it goes quiet, that doesn't mean you're not doing anything. It means you've succeeded. Because if every window, despite the excitement and the fact that it pays the whole bills, if every window you're signing, you're doing something wrong. Because if you're signing, especially with young players, is smart, then things should calm down after a while, because it means that you've signed wisely. And that's what I always think Liverpool do so well. So the wide position is one to watch. And that's partially because they know that Salah may leave in a year's time, and potentially Luis Diaz as well in the future. Although, as I've reported continually, from Liverpool's point of view, they value Diaz. And from Diaz's point of view, he still sees a way forwards at that football club. So there's no urgency, or there's no imminent exit with Luis Diaz, despite constant speculation. Liverpool are planning for Salah, planning for Diaz at this stage. But that doesn't mean they're not recruiting in a wide area with a view to the future. And that's where Crescencio Summerville comes in, because despite the fantastic season he had at Leeds United, it would make sense for him to step back up to the Premier League and join a club where he might not start every single week, but can develop and ultimately have a now impact, and as importantly, a future impact at a price that's very Liverpool-like. Because I'm told we're not looking at 40, 45, 50 million, 30, 35 million for Summerville, because Leeds are in a position where they have to sell. And unfortunately for Leeds, they are going to lose some star assets. I'm not as convinced, despite reports, that Archie Gray will go this summer. I think the player is more considered in his decision-making and is happy at Leeds United. But I think if the right offer comes in for Summerville, then that's an exit that I can see happening. I know we hear some links as well with Olise and Liverpool. Let's wait and see. It's twice the price. It's a big outlay. At the moment, I'm told Man City, Newcastle, Manchester United and Chelsea, and Summerville for Liverpool as one possibility. And then the other area is centre-back. And we have seen Liverpool look in the centre-back market for quite some time without necessarily finding the right kind of profile at the right kind of price. But I expect Liverpool to add a centre-back. And there's a few names we can rule out. First of all, Hincapié at Leverkusen, constantly linked with Liverpool. Not a name I expect to join. Tar now looks on his way to Bayern. Ignacio has been discussed internally, so might be one to watch. Pacho is another one that they really like. So young centre-back is the profile. And I think if the window ended and Liverpool didn't get a centre-back and a wide player, they would probably be disappointed. The other name with Liverpool that I'm always asked about, and we may as well kill two birds with one stone, is Levi Colwill, who Liverpool have had a long-standing appreciation for, but they're looking at the situation very distantly. They think nothing is possible this window. They've not moved. They've not even, to my knowledge, had a conversation on the agent side. It's simply a case of, if Colwill becomes available in the future, 2025 and onwards, Liverpool, PSG may enter that conversation. Now, I know we've heard reports about Bayern, and if they don't get Colwill again, but Chelsea are going to shut down any offers. They see Levi Colwill as integral. And there is a situation, potentially, where Reece James is suspended. If Ben Chilwell doesn't start the first game of the season and Conor Gallagher goes, who's the Chelsea captain for the first game of the season? It might be Levi Colwill, because he got given the armband for a couple of games last season. So Chelsea rate Colwill. And as long as Colwill, and this hasn't happened yet, as long as Colwill gets a guarantee from Enzo Maresca that when fit, he's the starting centre-back, not left-sided, like he had to play left-back in the beginning of the season, but centre-back, as long as he's the starting centre-back on the left side, then Colwill will be happy at Chelsea as well.
Yeah.
And then the only kind of interesting wrinkle is a year forwards. Because Colwell's gone bright and outstanding, under 21 euros, incredible. Gareth Southgate basically telling him, if you have another good season, you're in the mix to not only be at the Euros, but to compete with Harry Maguire for a starting spot. And then flash forwards a year through a mixture of in and out the side, injuries, playing on the left-hand side, Chelsea's form, whatever you put it down to, Colwell's not even in the England squad. So if another year was to pass, and then in 2025, he was to feel like he's not going to be in the mix for the 2026 World Cup, that's the summer when Colwill might start saying, I need to move somewhere to get what I'm looking for. But the Chelsea hope and belief is that they're aligned with Colwill, that he's going to be fit, centre-back, playing outstanding, one of the best centre-backs in England, and then he's got no reason to leave. Chelsea have got no reason to sell, and it will very quickly, therefore, if that scenario happens, be back in the England squad.
Yeah, I think he'd be mad to leave right now. I do. Even though Liverpool, well-oiled machine, I think sometimes too many young players. I was so happy to see Benjamin Šeško stay. I think so many young players leave so young. The one that stands out the most, it still pains me to this day, is Renato Sanchez. I just felt, don't leave. Just stay where you are. Like, you're comfortable. You know people thrive in that area. And before we move on to Arsenal, I want to ask about Manchester City as well. Obviously, we know they've got a lot going on with the league and everything else. But in terms of transfers, the only name I've really seen them linked to is Bruno Guimarães. Is that a deal you can see them triggering at some point in the coming weeks?
I think with Guimarães, it's more Man City at the moment. Arsenal have got no intention to trigger the release clause, to my knowledge. But let's wait and see whether clubs can capitalise on Newcastle's financial situation. People are wrongly presuming it's just clause. It expires, remember, very soon. And then after that, the door is shut and he's staying at Newcastle. But that's not my understanding. My understanding is that the clause, of course, will be used as a take it or leave it at this point. But if the clause expires, and as the window progresses, Newcastle still need money, then they may have to consider offers for Bruno Guimarães. There are other players that they can sell. But to my knowledge, they won't sell Botman and they won't sell Isak. Isak is the most untouchable player in the football club. It's also not true that Liverpool are interested in Anthony Gordon. They appreciate his profile. So when I say not interested, I don't mean they don't have respect for the player, but they're not coming in at the kind of price that would be required. And again, he's a not for sale player. So where do Newcastle find their money? Because they have managed to bring in one free transfer in Lloyd Kelly. That medical is pending, and a 5-year deal with a 1-year extension has been agreed. And then if they get James Trafford and there is optimism, that's going to be another package close to 20 million, but including add-ons. So then beyond that, how can Newcastle get 40, 50, 60 million or above to satisfy PSR concerns, but also add a wide player because they want Olise? That's 60 odd million. How can they do that without selling? Well, maybe 15, 20 million for Callum Wilson, 15, 20 million for Miguel Almiron. Maybe now they'll have to accept that Kieran Trippier goes, and Bayern have that long-standing interest, of course, and tried in January, perhaps a Sean Longstaff. But all of that adds up to maybe 70 million at most. Whereas you sell one player in Guimarães, you bring in 80 to 100 million, depending on who offers what. And then not only are you fine financially, but you can also go out in the market and add one or two more. And let me be clear, because Newcastle fans somehow feel that everybody is against them. As long as there's a release clause, there's a possibility of an exit. But Guimarães is happy at Newcastle, and Eddie Howe has said he wants to keep the player. But again, I come back to what I said before. If you only let one go and it's Guimarães, and you get a big amount of money, In midfield, they've got Joe Linton, who can play there or in the front three. They've got Sandro Tonali coming back from his ban. They've got Sean Longstaff at the moment. They've got Elliot Anderson. They've got Lewis Miley. And they would probably have money to bring in another midfielder. So as big a blow as Bruno is, if it secures the club's financial footing and allows them to bring in 2 or 3 others, then there might be some logic to it. So my understanding is that Arsenal are not going to trigger the clause. But if a deal becomes available around 80 million, then at the right structure, they might consider it. But it's more Man City. And if City could get Bruno Guimarães at 20 million below his clause later in the window, that's a deal that they might consider, especially now we know that Lucas Paquetá is not going to happen. So keep an eye on Man City rather than Arsenal. With Arsenal, the midfield situation is that they need to define Rice on paper, not in practice, because the versatility is an asset. But they need to say, okay, is Rice predominantly on paper a 6 or an 8? And then whatever player they get in midfield will complement Rice. The other thing, of course, is Thomas Partey going to stay or go? My understanding is he could just stay another year, but there is concrete Saudi interest again. They still have to persuade the player. And then they'll move in midfield. And Martin Zubimendi is still a realistic target. And the challenge there is not on fee. There's a release clause anyway. It's on persuading Zubimendi, who's kind of in love with Sociedad and wanted to stay in January, wanted to play in the Champions League knockouts, and is just really settled and doesn't want to move necessarily for the ambition of Premier League so much as might just like Sociedad and their project and that lifestyle and everything about that football club. So that's the difficulty in persuading him that he should have the ambition to move to a club like Arsenal. The other midfield target, long-standing, is Douglas Luiz. It's Juventus negotiating at the moment with Villa with 2 players, including Weston McKennie and a part cash, part player structure. So Arsenal are not in that conversation yet, but let's wait and see whether Luiz gets over the line. Juventus, the last time I checked, were optimistic. But if that falls through, there may be a later point where Arsenal could capitalise on Aston Villa's need to sell. So it is quite quiet on the midfield front at the moment, but this is also an indication of the fact that Arsenal were working on Sesko. So we know that finding a striker is a priority. They want a young left back that, like Yoel Hato, could be centre back that can play left back or could be left back that could play centre back. Milos Kirkus is another name they've looked at. Arsenal and Chelsea are quite serious about him, even though Bournemouth don't want to sell. But the reality for Arsenal is that they have to work out big outgoings. They have to resolve the Ramsdale situation. They probably will get rid of either Eddie Nketiah or, at a less likely long shot, Gabriel Jesus. They'll be open to offers for both at the right price. And like I said before, they have to resolve the situation with Thomas Partey as well. And then they'll know who they can move for. And this is just the reality of when you have a big window like 12 months ago and you spend 250 plus million, Timber, Rice, Havertz, you can't just back that up again with another 100, 150, 200 million window without either outgoings or having to think very carefully with PSR about your financial situation. So when everyone sort of says Osimhen Arsenal, that's not a deal that they'll do. Because it's not just about the release clause and it's not just about the wages, it's also about the agent fees. So the only way that Arsenal, like with Guimarães, would ever enter a conversation for a type of player like Osimhen is if it doesn't become about release clause or nothing. If there's a different deal to be had, that might be a different story. But at the moment, Arsenal are making sure that they sustain themselves financially, and that could lead to not necessarily a quieter window, but a window that focuses on outgoings first.
Which I always feel, look, I know that there's obviously a court case going on today. There's talk of Villa now suing the league because certain clubs, and I understand the logic, want to be able to just spend. But we spoke about this at large last week, and I think especially the younger generation of football fan, and certainly football, you said Newcastle fans feel like the world is against them at the minute, and I do understand it when you've got people circling for your players and you've got rich owners, but you can't spend much more. And as you've said, one of the reasons they can't spend isn't even because they've overspent, it's because they had clauses which saw everybody's wages go up when they made the Champions League. And then they essentially fouled last season, which means their wage bill is higher, and you've got to balance these things off. But I was saying to people last week, if you go back just 10, 15 years, the amount of clubs that were nearly going out of business, and some of which did, for 50 to 60 million pound debts, the idea that fans are just happy to let potentially hundreds of millions and billions of pounds of debt, because the contract to a player is a debt at the end of the day. The fact that it's fine to let a debt like that go. You're not all going to have owners like City and Roman Abramovich. I honestly think people are being really naive to the fact of, I heard the Brighton, one of the senior Brighton officials say this on TalkSport about 5 months ago. He said, isn't it mad that football is the only industry where the clubs are asking to lose more money? No other business in the world wants to lose money anyway, let alone lose more of it. It's crazy. On Arsenal, though, just away from the finances stuff, because it triggers people. Zubimendi, I've seen some tweets of people sort of summarising what you've said about him. Is that a player Arsenal still interested in?
Yeah, Zubimendi is one that Arsenal is still interested in. And I think it comes down to the fact that the long-standing interest dates back more than one window. It's just about persuading the player. So we kind of covered his situation. And because he's in love with Sociedad, I just don't see him being desperate to move. But he's at a more interesting point in his career, I think, than other players, simply because of the age. We're not talking about a 19, 20-year-old Sesko where you can get the move in a year, you can get the move the year after. Sesko could probably wait until 2026 and still get the move. Whereas with Zubimendi, he's 25 years of age. And we know that's quite an important age in football, because a lot of clubs, when they're looking to invest that number, think about 25 or under. And as soon as you become 26, 27, they think, great player, but we might not get 5, 6, 7 seasons out of you. We might only get 3, 4, 5 seasons out of you. And then is the investment worth the same? So I think it's a crossroads for Zubimendi, because if he doesn't go now, I'm not saying he's in any way old, but I think you turn 26 and then you are less appealing at the kind of money that's required to land a player like that. But it wouldn't surprise me if Arsenal tried for Zubimendi once again. I think that's a very concrete possibility. And then just regarding what you were talking about with Villa, this all came from Nassif Sawiris, who's the Villa owner. And he did an excellent interview in the Financial Times by 2 top journalists there. And I recommend that you give it a read. And Aston Villa's point is not so much the financial rules are rubbish and we should be able to spend what we like. Aston Villa's point was that the threshold for allowable losses should be raised to reflect an inflated market. So what they want is the threshold to go from 105 to 135 million over a 3-year cycle. And that was defeated by the clubs. So this is not necessarily a Premier League problem. The Premier League problem put that amendment to a vote. And when they did so, it was defeated by the clubs. And I think that this is where we have a split in the Premier League. And this is, I suppose, why we have the 2/3 majority to pass anything. You've got clubs that want to keep the number of losses low. One, because they feel that they're not going to spend that high because maybe they're smaller clubs. And 2, because they don't want to jeopardize the future of their clubs. And 3, because they know that that number may hamper some of the bigger clubs that do just want to spend, and back that they can sell players and back that they can bring in non-football revenue. So the smaller clubs feel that the number helps keep it a level playing field. Whereas at the moment, the bigger clubs feel that it's just impossible to navigate in an inflated market. And Villa would also argue that they're now entering into the Champions League and they need to keep up. And they need to bring in players because of the Champions League that can protect them and their long-term future. So they want to be opportunistic and they want to spend a bit more. And this is ultimately a very short-term issue, because if everything goes according to plan, PSR will only be in for one more full financial year and season. And then after that, the rules will be amended to reflect UEFA's squad cost control measures with just a higher percentage. In other words, clubs will be able to spend on transfers and agents' fees and wages 85% of their revenue. And that's more aligned with UEFA. So then we won't be talking about PSR anymore.
No, we won't. I think there's just, it's the can of worms it opens. And it's one of the, I understand why these 2-week hearings are in private, because that's very typical for this type of situation. But I do think there's a huge public interest in this around genuinely understanding what's going on. And I say that because I understand what Villa are asking for in isolation there, but they're also supporting what City are challenging, which is that sponsorship should be able to essentially be whatever the company coming in says they should be. There should be no third party that's reviewing it, and we should be able to spend what we want. So when you start looking at all of these little cases and you start putting them together, I think it is sensible. And again, I'm maybe looking at this because my lawyers do this to me whenever I talk to them. They always paint the worst case scenario for you to think about so you make the right decisions. And it's great. Let's lift the threshold for a season or two until the new UEFA rules come in. But are we then not going to start? They've been told no, so they're going to sue. I was thinking about the situation with Man United and Liverpool the other day. We were told a decade ago, no, you can't have more of the TV distribution money, even though you bring in the majority of that money. Can we now start suing? Because that's the tyranny of the majority, isn't it? Because if you actually look at the money we would have earned compared to our top six rivals over the last decade, we would have brought in £1 billion more in TV money than those clubs if that rule went through. The problem with the suing, it's the suing and taking legal action that I'm worried about, because theoretically multiple clubs and teams can start doing this for rules and regulations that they feel that have hampered or damaged their teams. And that's the issue I have with. I understand Villa's argument, but that's why we're in a democratic process. And suddenly we don't want to be in the democratic process. We want to be in a dictatorship where the minority gets a rule. That's the worrying element for me. And when it's your club, when you're a Villa fan, Everton fans have definitely sided with the guys suing the Prem because they feel hard done by. I understand why in this instance you are fighting for the minority voter to get what you want because it best serves your club. But none of you a decade ago were fighting for the minority voter when it came to Man United and Liverpool wanting more money to be pumped in through what you would perceive to be, some might perceive to be more legitimate means, because it was genuine TV money. And that's my issue with all this argument, is people will pick and and by the way, I disagree with Man United and Liverpool getting more of the money, even though I was a Man United fan, because for me, I looked at La Liga, and as good as the league is, as amazing as some of the teams are, the Premier League is a bigger league because of how we do things. More rivals, more drama. I prefer the league. And I thought to myself, why go down the route? It's like when we try and do the Americanization. Why are we copying sports that we're bigger than? It doesn't make sense to me. So I that's my concern with this. But that's another big, long debate.
Yeah, I think what I would say is just a few things. So first of all, factually, we should make it very clear. Villa are considering legal action. They're not taking legal action yet. And it's very easy to say that you are considering it, to put on pressure. Let's see whether they take it. The second thing is that Manchester City's legal action is bigger than the Premier League. So what they are saying is that they challenge the league's position on associated party transactions. And you may remember that the majority of Premier League clubs voted for the rules on associated party transactions. Manchester City were not one of them. So what City are basically saying, without going into too much legal detail and sending people to sleep, is that the Premier League are not in a position where they or the clubs can just vote on something like associated party transaction regulations, because outside of the Premier League, there is a wider anti-competition debate to be had. And if they can prove that the Premier League's position, regardless of if the clubs voted for it or not, is anti-competitive, then that legally will triumph an internal vote that the clubs did. But there's also a fascinating where's the line? Because at the moment, we've only seen PSR. Maybe it will change with Manchester City and the 115 charges. But at the moment, we've only seen PSR hurt with respect. And I'm strictly speaking financially here. I would never call any club in the Premier League small. But budgetary-wise, it's only hit the smaller or medium-sized clubs. Everton, Nottingham Forest, Leicester. And Forest are a difficult case, because remember, they bought so many players that we all raised eyebrows at how much business they were doing. And eventually, and unfortunately, it came back to bite them, particularly because they were not able to sell Brennan Johnson quick enough or for a high enough amount, because he was waiting to go to Spurs. With Everton, it's a bit different as well, because you could sort of say the charges come from the fact that at the same time as struggling and having bottom half finishes, they were spending a lot of money on their new stadium. And again, they say they couldn't sell Richarlison for 80 million. They had to sell on the financial deadline day for 60 million. And that came back to bite them. And Leicester again, and I think this is where Villa take their position, did so well, won the Premier League, got into Europe. And what does that mean? Bonuses, wage bills increase. And then suddenly they had a bad season and down they go. And you're in big, big trouble. And even selling players like Barnes and Maddison, you got high wage bills, high operational costs. Leicester built an incredible trading facility, money spent on that. I know you can offset some of these costs on the books, but you've still got the maintenance, you've still got the expanded staff, and all of these things hurt the smaller clubs, financially speaking. Now, if in the end, Man City get charged and Chelsea, remember, being investigated, but no charges yet from the Premier League, then we'll start to realise that all clubs are in a very tricky position. Newcastle are another one right on the line. But I think the point that clubs are making that are against the current rules is that, first of all, it's damaging the whole of the Premier League, because we're seeing PSG being able to move. We're seeing Juventus, who don't have great finances, being able to do a deal for Douglas Luiz. But ultimately, a club like Arsenal don't want to come in that conversation because the cost is too high. So the clubs are saying the whole of the Premier League will be devalued if it's not in a position collectively to bring in star names. Other leagues will catch up. Saudi will capitalize. And then the other tiny side point is just, where do you draw the line on voting? 2/3 majority, 14 clubs or more is the current scenario for every vote, right? And I think Man City believe it should just be majority. But the challenge with majority is if the big six collectively combine, you've got 6 towards the 11 that you need. And it's maybe easier to get to 11 than it is to get to 14. And obviously, if you go unanimous, there's always a danger that nothing passes. So I don't see any scenario where you can have a better version on a vote than 2/3 majority. The only other option I think that would be plausible is majority. But the danger is that's even worse for the Premier League clubs outside of the big six, because if they gang up on things that benefit them, then ultimately the other clubs may be the ones that get put at a disadvantage.
And this is a great breakdown. And I think there's so many permutations for this. And equally, like you just said, let's say City are successful and it's 11. If you get 11, then that'll go through. And then right now, City might look at this and go, we get an 11 on this. But in most of the other things to be voted for, when you look at most of the votes that go through for things, it's nearly always pretty much unanimously a yes or a no. So they can end up setting a situation for themselves, City, where they end up missing out on things, even narrowly, but they're still not happy, because most of the smaller clubs, budgetary-wise, are not going to vote for things that are going to allow an absolute huge gulf to be created. And even in this situation, and what I love about it, when you listen to fans speak, they're like, well, Newcastle fans and Villa fans, we always want our owners to pump in money. We don't want there to be this monopoly anymore. But if you look at the I know that they're all rich compared to every single one of us, but if every owner was able to spend whatever they want, you would still create that monopoly. Now, my club, Man United, would be in it. We have such huge income, and we have rich owners, especially now that have come in. And I think Ineos would be willing to pump in. Now, if it was if it was in the rules for us to pump in whatever money we want, I think Ineos and Sir Jim would do that this summer. They give me that kind of vibe. Man United, my club, are going to be okay. But all you're going to do is create that gulf again. But it might be with 3 additional teams, with 2 or 3 falling out. You'll still be in the same situation with Newcastle, City, Man United, Chelsea, and then maybe 2 more added to the mix that can spend the absolute exorbitant amounts of money, and then everybody else will start moaning again. And that's the issue I have with this. I just view it as, a lot of people look at it as, I'm going to pull the ladder up on this particular rule because I'm all right, Jack. And we're not thinking about the wider situation. But as I say, it's a conversation that could go on for days and days and days. A few super chats here before we end. This is Ben. I would love to hear your thoughts on if Arsenal go for a different number 9 now, or if they go for a winger instead.
Yeah, I think it's more a traditional striker at this point, and we know they've had several names on the list. So Evan Ferguson at Brighton, to my knowledge, is still there. Victor Gyökeres, who kind of has the highest price tag, but unlike the Osimhens of this world, the wages are going to be more within Arsenal's budget at least. And sometimes clubs feel that at the right structure and payment plan, a bigger fee is more an investment than an expense. I think Todd Bowley said that in an interview with Sportico the other day as well. And Ferguson's the same. Brighton don't want to lose him. Didn't have the best season last campaign, but that might knock the price down. And then the wages are not going to be anywhere near the 250k a week that a player like Victor Osimhen would like. And we spoke about it before, Joshua Zirkzee too. If Milan don't get that over the line, keep an eye on Arsenal, keep an eye on Manchester United.
And final super chat. Hey, Ben, have you heard anything about if Arteta doesn't win anything next season, will he be sacked? It feels like his job is safe no matter what.
Yeah, I think the last part of what you say is absolutely correct. Mikel Arteta's job not only safe, but I expect him to sign a new deal. We heard reports, didn't we, when Xavi first announced that he was leaving, only to subsequently U-turn and then be sacked. What a crazy story that was at Barca. But when Xavi said he was going on his terms, we heard links with Mikel Arteta and Barcelona. That was not true, to my knowledge, and Arteta is untouchable. And that's not just Arsenal's perspective. That's something that I'm told Arteta has told Arsenal, that he's going nowhere, that he has every intent to sign a new deal. And the expectation is that he will sign new long-term terms to stay at Arsenal because they back him. And whether Arsenal win anything or don't win anything at this point, the feeling is that the project's getting better and better and better season on season on season. And now the aim is for Arsenal to consolidate, being that kind of near automatic Champions League team. Because when you get it season on season, so you're not saying, oh, can Arsenal get in the top four, which is ultimately what Chelsea and Manchester United are saying. You're just presuming they'll be there. And that was Chelsea under Abramovich. That's Manchester City now. That's largely been Liverpool when Jurgen Klopp was in charge, despite a little bit, obviously, of a wobble that saw them not in it last season. And that means when you get that for 2, 3, 4 seasons running, you budget for that. And therefore, you can spend more and do more. But the thing to understand about Arteta is that he has said to every single one of these young stars that has extended, and Arsenal have had many player renewals over the last kind of 18 months or so. And in each of them, whether it's Saka or Martinelli and so on, each of them have been told by Arteta that this isn't just about them signing. This is about a collective project sticking together. And he will also, therefore, put pen to paper because he's told everyone else that when agreeing, they're not going to have to worry about too much change. So unless Arsenal end up in kind of mid-table mediocrity and the project moves backwards, and there's no indication that that will happen, but that is just football for any manager. You can't lose 5, 6, 7 games and be mid-table at any big club without your job being under discussion. But before all of that, and maybe, who knows, before a ball's even kicked, the advancement on Arteta signing a new deal is expected. I've been told that for many months, that Arteta will sign a new deal at Arsenal. So there's no danger at the moment that he's going anywhere. And I think rightly so, because I would never say for any minute that if you don't win trophies, you've had a success. But what I would say is that in modern football, remember, I think it was Wenger, wasn't it? Or Mourinho got derided for saying it was a great achievement to be second with Man United. But many years ago, when Wenger said, you know what? Being in the Champions League, being in the top 4 is a big achievement. And when Wenger first said it, I think he was laughed at, because how dare somebody that managed the Invincibles, that won the Premier League a few years on, be saying it's actually quite a good achievement to just be in the top 4 and be in regular Champions League. And I think that's the point of the commitment to Arteta and the patience that Arsenal have given him. And it helped in the first season to have won the FA Cup. But the patience he's had is because there's a realization within football, not just Arsenal football, that when you're building a project, it takes 3, 4, 5 years. And if at the end of those 3, 4, 5 years, you're challenging, you're close to winning things, you're regularly in Champions League, then you've stabilized and you've elevated your club to that level where financially you can start planning. There's no way if Arsenal were 4th, then 5th, then 4th, then 5th, then 8th, then 10th, then out of Europe, then back up to 4th and 5th. There's no way they could keep having windows like Rice, Timber, Havertz. It's a reflection of the fact that under Arteta, trophies or no trophies, the club is moving in the right direction. And now they're at the point where the pressure is ramped up, because if you've built that project, you can't keep saying you're building. You can't keep saying that players are young and developing. So now they've got all the tools, which means in the next 2 or 3 seasons, there is pressure to back that up with silverware. Yeah. But ultimately, Arsenal are invested in Arteta. Arteta is invested in Arsenal.
I hear you. Final super chat. One came in while we were speaking. Says, can player prices be regulated? The issue seems to be there when clubs like Napoli can quote 100 million for a good to average player. Will continue to have these issues.
No, I don't think we can have regulation. I mean, ultimately, you could get to a point where you had de facto regulation if you put other things in place. So were you like in American sports to have very clear guidelines on what clubs can and can't spend and salary caps, then eventually the regulation would come, because if footballers were earning, and it would never pass because of agents and players, but if footballers suddenly had a cap and that cap was a significant reduction to all clubs' wage bills, then you could argue that there would be a ratio inadvertently driving the market down, and that would result in a more sustainable business for clubs. And of course, the clubs would love a situation where everything just went down instead of up in terms of wages and prices, but that's just not football. Players' price is based upon a variety of things. It's not a capped amount. It's calculated based upon demand, age, length left on contract. And people say, well, how can a club possibly put that valuation on? Like Chelsea fans said to me, how can Brighton possibly think that Moises Caicedo is 115 million? Or how can the Enzo Fernandez saga be dragging on and they have the nerve to demand a release clause? Well, one, the release clause can be there to ward off the market. And therefore, if someone chooses to pay it, they accept that it's an inflated number. And two, Chelsea paid that number for Moises Caicedo. Arsenal paid that number for Declan Rice. Manchester City paid that number for Erling Haaland. Real Madrid paid that number for Jude Bellingham. It was a good number, by the way, for Jude Bellingham. It was lower, I think, than they anticipated, but it was still a massive amount of money. So as long as clubs are doing these deals, like how often have you seen ever in football a top target, like a indisputably A-lister, want a move and not get the move? The reality of the situation is that top players move and they move for big money, and the money goes up and up and up because the market's inflated like many other businesses. So I don't think we're ever in a position where football could turn around and say, we need an independent body to regulate on fees. Sometimes it goes to court with like academy players and things like that, and there is a tribunal that decides the fee. But generally speaking, I think that the seller, when they have an elite prospect and they have demand, is always in the position where they can get big money.
There we go. Look, everyone who's tuned in, I want to say thank you to our super chatters. Everyone who's hit the like button so far, thank you. Make sure you've got that smashed before you leave. Also, join our transfer and notification group chat by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the live chat. Until next time, everybody. And yes, I do look like I'm off to Miami with this shirt. It's a classic shirt. Remember, don't let your clothes wear you. You wear them. And if people don't like them, that's their insecurity. Remember that. Listen, until next time, people, take care. Goodbye. God bless. And we'll... Oh, by the way, this is going to take you through to our Straight Facts show that comes out at 4:30 today with Mo and Hussam. So we'll see you all at 4 p.m. Take care. Goodbye. God bless. And we'll see you soon.